The Jets have, in my opinion, the best and most complete roster in the NFL. And despite not coming close to making the playoffs last year, they're set up to be legitimate Super Bowl contenders in 2024. They have an elite defense, a future Hall of Fame quarterback, some really good weapons on the outside and in the backfield. They rebuilt their offensive line by signing the top 2 available tackles, one of those being Tyron Smith, another future Hall of Famer that's coming off his best season in several years. And watching the Jets 2023 tape, even though it wasn't a good team, I kept coming away impressed by key role players that I wasn't expecting anything from, and top to bottom, I think the roster is very deep. It's not a sure thing. They are going to be relying on injury luck as much as anyone, and we've only seen Aaron Rodgers take 3 snaps in a Jets uniform, but on paper, this is a roster that should be able to make a deep playoff run. So in this video, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the Jets roster, breaking down every single player and how they compare to the rest of the league. If you're new to this series, I've given every player in the NFL a rating from 65 to 99. 65 is a practice squad, bottom of the roster type of player. 99 is prime Revis, and 75 is an average acceptable starter. Those numbers get normalized into ratings for each positional group, and the positional ratings make up the offensive and defensive scores based on this weighting table. And I led off the video saying that the Jets have the best roster in the NFL, which I think they do. You can see my NFL roster ratings here, which ignores coaches and just looks at which team has the best players. And looking at the before and after of when Joe Douglas was hired, he's done a good job adding talent and building a competitive roster on paper, which is the key word with this whole video. He doesn't have a perfectly clean record by any means. They ended up with essentially nothing from their first draft class in 2020. They drafted Zach Wilson the next year. They signed Aaron Rodgers, but the rest of the 2022 offseason was a disaster with washed up receivers, a terrible OC hire, and a draft class that didn't return a ton of value in year 1, but in total they've hit on enough players through the draft and free agency to build a top tier roster. The 2022 class is going to go down as a top 3 to 4 draft class ever, and those players are entering their prime. New York's been one of the best teams at finding contributors in undrafted free agency under Joe Douglas, and I don't agree with every move, but the 2023 offseason overall I thought was very good. So they have the pieces to not just compete with anyone, but to be a dominant 14 to 15 win team, but the case isn't as open and shut as it might seem for a couple reasons. I have the Jets 4th in my actual power rankings, which factors in coaches, so that drops them down 3 spots. I think Jeff Ulbrich and Robert Saleh are quality defensive coaches. They have the 8th best defensive coordinator rating, which includes the entire brain trust holistically, but they're dead last in head coach and offensive coordinator. Robert Saleh has shown nothing that tells me he can elevate a roster with significant weaknesses or adapt when something like the Aaron Rodgers injury happens, and I'm not going to hold you to a very high standard when you have the 2023 Jets O-line and Zach Wilson at quarterback, but my faith in Nathaniel Hackett is basically non-existent. So the coaching staff is the clear weak link, but I will say, if given the option, I'm taking players over coaches in a heartbeat. Hackett and Saleh aren't going to manufacture a good team with bad personnel, but with this roster, it's pretty easy for them to just not get in the way. That kind of leads me into my second caveat though, which is that they're relying on a lot of high injury risk players. Aaron Rodgers, Mike Williams, and half of the O-line are either coming off an injury or injury prone historically, so if enough key starters get knocked out, the Jets don't have someone like Kevin Stefanski that can patch together a competitive team. Now that we've gotten the disclaimers out of the way, we can actually get into the preview, and we're going to start with a quick review of the 2023 season statistically. This was as extreme of a split between offense and defense as you could possibly have. They ranked dead last in 10 out of the 12 key offensive metrics, and as you would expect, when we average it out, they had the worst offense in the NFL, but their defense ranked first and was completely dominant. It wasn't enough to overcome the offense, but the core pieces are still intact, and with Aaron Rodgers and improved O-line, this looks like a complete team on both sides of the ball. So breaking down the roster and starting with quarterback, you can't overstate how much of an upgrade it is going from Zach Wilson, Trevor Siemian, and Tim Boyle to Aaron Rodgers. You can debate between the Jets, Falcons, and Patriots, who had the worst quarterback room in the NFL last year. I would lean Atlanta just because their supporting cast was so much better, but regardless, this was a quarterback room that actively prevented the Jets' offense from functioning, and Aaron Rodgers is a quarterback that can elevate and at his best be the entire offense. Dropping him onto the field, you're going up 4 to 5 tiers of quarterback play immediately, depending on how you define it. Now, I have the Jets ranked 9th, which might seem low, but the reason is that we just don't know which version of Aaron Rodgers the Jets are going to get. His 2020 season was, in my lifetime, one of the peaks of NFL quarterback play, firmly in the same tier as Brady, Mahomes, etc. in their peaks. But over the next couple years, he gradually descended into the top 8 to 12 tier, which is enough to make a deep playoff run with this roster, but not someone that's going to carry you. And coming off the Achilles injury, I don't know exactly what to expect from Aaron Rodgers. He could be the same player we saw in 2022. He could bounce back and re-enter the top tier of quarterbacks, or he could continue to regress. I think somewhere around the 12th to 14th best quarterback is probably his floor, but having not seen him play in 2 years, there is some uncertainty there. But I love the Tyrod Taylor signing. He would have comfortably been the Jets' best healthy quarterback last year, and I have him rated as the best backup in the NFL. In 2023, he led quarterbacks with an 8.9% big time throw rate, according to PFF, 2.6% higher than Matthew Stafford at second, but he had a 1.2% turnover worthy play rate, which was the lowest in the NFL. It was only 224 dropbacks, so the sample size is small, but he's coming off a career season, and he's the type of quarterback that if Aaron Rodgers has to miss 4 games, he can go 2-2. And then they took Jordan Travis in the 5th round as a developmental player. I wasn't a huge fan of his tape compared to some other people, but perfectly fine with that pick on day 3. I just think he has some serious ball placement issues that are insurmountable if he can improve, and he's an older player with average physical traits, so it's hard to really bank on that getting fixed, but he reads the field really well. He has borderline elite touch and control over elevation and trajectory. He does a lot of things at a high level, so we'll see if he can turn into something. And you look at the rest of the offense that's going to be surrounding Aaron Rodgers, it's an extremely well-rounded group. Every positional group ranks in the top 20, and I have them with the 3rd best running back room in the NFL. That group is led by Breece Hall, who's one of many players on the Jets offense that's better than their stats would indicate. I didn't even realize until I opened his page just now, he hasn't had 1,000 yards rushing in a single season. But for anyone that watches a Jets game or watches his tape, there isn't much confusion as to why he hasn't been more productive. The Jets offensive line struggles were not just limited to pass protection. Their running backs had pretty much no space to work with. Breece Hall was hit before the line of scrimmage on 47% of his carries, which was 6th highest in the NFL, but he still managed to rank 3rd in yards after contact, 6th in forced missed tackles. He's really the complete package as a running back, and a player that if you just give him not the worst run blocking in the NFL, he can put up elite production. He has breakaway speed. He's 220 pounds, so he can carry a full workload. He doesn't just have the elite top speed, he can gear up to that speed almost instantly, so he can afford to pace his runs, to manipulate the flow of the linebackers, and then turn on the Jets into the open space that he created. He's elusive in open space or in the backfield. Some of his most impressive runs are 2 to 3 yard gains where he's just dodging traffic. He has a bouncy jump cut, doesn't lose any momentum when he's transitioning in and out of moves. He has excellent vision and anticipation of how the defense is going to react, and then he has the perfect balance of creativity when he has to make something happen without trying to do too much and gamble into negative plays. He actually started out the season with 2 fumbles in the first 3 weeks, but then didn't have a single fumble after week 3. Dating back to college, he's always had very good ball security, so that's not a major concern. And he actually was very productive as a pass catcher. He had the 2nd most receiving yards out of running backs last year. That's actually a number that I would want to see go down in 2024. I think for the most part, Breece Hall targets were either a crutch for Nathaniel Hackett or a crutch for the Jets quarterback. New York ran the 4th most screen passes to running backs last year. It honestly felt like more than that. That's one of the few plays they actually felt like they could execute because, a slip screen, you're supposed to let defenders into the backfield. The Jets offensive line was very good at doing that, so they called a ton of slip screens. And he was also just a check down magnet for whoever the Jets had in at quarterback. They either had to get rid of the ball quickly because the pressure was closing in, or they had been conditioned to expect the pressure, so they were moving off of reads prematurely. Watching Garrett Wilson's tape, who we'll get into, it's so frustrating how many times he's getting open out of a break, break. He should be the primary read if the quarterback can wait not even half a second, but Zach Wilson or Trevor Siemian or whoever was just so paranoid that they moved off the progression prematurely. So I have Breece Hall as tied for the second best running back with Bijan Robinson and behind Christian McCaffrey, but the rest of the running back room is incredibly deep. They drafted Braylon Allen in the 4th round, pick 134. I actually had him at 134 on my board, so nice coincidence there. His 2023 tape was extremely underwhelming to me, and throughout pretty much the entire draft process, I just did not see the hype with Braylon Allen. But then like a week before the draft, I think someone suggested it to me. I went back and watched a couple games of his 2022 tape, and I started to really see the vision. I didn't end up changing my grade, but if there's one player in this class that I could most easily see being wrong on, it's Braylon Allen. They changed their offensive scheme, and last year they had him running almost exclusively out of the shotgun, which is not his game at all. He was forced to try to be Le'Veon Bell and, dance around, sift through traffic. He needs to be taking handoffs from under center, getting downhill, and really using his power. I put Israel Abanikanda as the 3rd running back, but it's not really looking good for his future with the Jets. They took him in the 5th round in 2023, and I thought he was a decent prospect, extremely fast, perfect fit for an outside zone scheme, but really more of a big play threat that's going to have 1 carry for 60 yards and then like 18 carries for 20 yards. And he barely got any playing time as a rookie. I assume it's because of pass pro. That's almost always what it is with a running back. So if that doesn't improve, then he'll probably never see the field anywhere. But I thought even on a very small number of carries, you could see the limitations in his game as it is right now. He's listed at 215 pounds, but even back when he was a prospect, I remember that just never really passed the eye test because he doesn't run with much power. The contact balance, the ability to drive his legs and move piles, shrug off arm tackles has just never been there with Israel Abanikanda. So when he does run between the tackles, he's not very effective, but the actual result is that he just bounces everything outside. The best way to break big runs on outside zone is not by hitting the designed C gap, it's by finding the cutback lane and hitting the open space, and he kind of has blinders on for anything in between the tackles, so he can't really spot those opportunities. And the Jets actually kind of helped him lean into that tendency by not really forcing him to read things out. Almost 1/3 of his carries were crack toss, and he averaged 5.1 yards per attempt on those runs. On other plays, he averaged 2.3 yards, so you can really see the difference in effectiveness running inside versus out. The fact that they took 2 running backs in the 2024 draft shouldn't make you feel very confident about Abanikanda's future, and the player who I could easily see replacing him as the 3rd running back is Isaiah Davis out of South Dakota State. He's basically the inverse of Israel Abanikanda. He's not a great athlete, but he's extremely powerful and probably has the best vision of any running back in this class. Watching him maneuver through traffic is just mesmerizing. The pace and rhythm that he runs with is so aesthetically pleasing. It's like I was saying with Breece Hall, but to an even more extreme degree. He can just bounce around, zigzag in tight quarters. He's got eyes on the back of his head, so he can spot tackle attempts, identify opening lanes, and he's the king of running like 25 actual yards to get 8, but it's all purposeful. He's not just dancing around mindlessly. The fact that he's not a great athlete does limit his upside as far as being, top 5 to 8 running back in the NFL, but he's so good at the position, it wouldn't surprise me at all if he can carve out some sort of role. The Jets rank 12th at receiver, led by Garrett Wilson, who is a very similar story to Breece Hall. Out of every receiver that I've watched on tape from 2023, Garrett Wilson and then Pop Douglas for the Patriots are the 2 receivers whose production was limited the most by their surroundings, and Wilson is a clear 1 on that list. He had just over 1,000 receiving yards in 2023, 3 touchdowns. For the 10th overall pick, that's slightly underwhelming production, but if you watch his tape and you look at some of the more advanced metrics, it's obvious that he is so much better than his box score. These separation plots from PFF that they have for receivers and corners are my favorite stats for those positions. I think they line up with the tape most frequently, and you can see Garrett Wilson had the 3rd highest separation grade. That's not just looking at targeted reps, that's every single route that he's run. He was slightly below average in catch point and yak grade, which I'll get into in a second, but that's still the one limitation to his game. But purely as a route runner, I would put Garrett Wilson in my top 5, and I could easily talk myself into top 3. There are more than 3 receivers that are more technically sound route runners than Garrett Wilson. Someone like Cooper Kupp, Mari Cooper at this point in his career are more consistently efficient with their footwork. Wilson's great in that area, but he'll have 3 to 4 routes a game where he stumbles at the top of the route or kind of drifts in and out of a break. But what puts Wilson in that top tier for me is just the raw, natural ability to explode out of cuts at extremely sharp angles. Wilson and Justin Jefferson, to me, are in a tier of their own just in terms of being able to make extreme change of directions and accelerate out of their breaks. If you give him off coverage, it's pretty much automatic separation. When he has space to read your leverage and technique, you just have no chance of sticking with him. He can sit down on a stop or a comeback in 1 to 2 throttle steps, very efficient on the vertical plane, and he's borderline elite against press coverage. He has a huge release package, executes so many different things at a high level. His tape is basically just him practicing every single release that's ever been used, and Zach Wilson either getting sacked or not looking in his direction. Looking at his reception perception data, he had an 81% success rate against press coverage in 2023. He had pretty much the same success rate last year. That's 92nd percentile across Matt Harmon's entire database, and out of the receivers he's charted, it ranked 3rd in 2023. And then you can see on this table, his last 2 seasons ranked 24th and 26th, dating back to 2014. Still about 3 to 4% behind Odell Beckham, who's a god, but he's in really good company here. And he's about as good after the catch as you can be for a 195-pound receiver. He has a superhuman ability to anticipate tacklers behind him and have his back to the defense, but still understand the layout of all the defenders. And then the rare change of direction ability allows him to make the catch, instantly spin out of the tackle, and attack open space. You can see on this play against Washington, he sits down in between these 2 defenders, makes the catch, squares up like he's about to run towards the logo, but in his peripheral, he can see the second defender closing in, and then he spins out to the left and avoids both defenders. Right here, he's running a quick out. He's got the hook defender trailing behind him, but then when he makes the catch, he identifies the flat defender closing in. On a dime, he's able to reverse his path, not run into that tackle. The hook defender tries to bring him down, but he escapes that tackle attempt, hits the open field. This play against Houston, he's running a dig route. He's got the free safety crashing over the top, the backside safety bracketing him from the left, and when he makes the catch, he's able to instantly stop his momentum so he doesn't drift off into traffic. That breaks the free safety's ankles, it avoids contact from the backside safety, and then the hook defender's coming from behind to try to finish the tackle, but he effortlessly transitions into a juke and avoids that one as well. So the route running is elite. The yak is really good, especially for a player of his size. He doesn't have the power of someone like AJ Brown, but extremely elusive after the catch. He's just not very good at winning through contact at the catch point, and that was exacerbated by how Nathaniel Hackett used him. He had just under a 30% contested catch rate last year, and he led the NFL with 37 contested targets. That's not because he can't create separation, it's because he's running so many ISO routes down the sideline where, unless the corner you're going up against is absolute cheeks, if you're getting targeted, it's going to be a contested target. In 2023, he ran 92 fade routes, which was the most in the NFL and the second most for a receiver since 2016. And if we look at fade route percentage, the top 3 were all Jets receivers. He's capable of making some jaw-dropping spectacular catches, but he's 5'11". There's a limit to how effective he's going to be trying to high point the ball through contact. They've got him running the Devontae Parker route tree. Garrett Wilson should be attacking space, creating separation over the middle of the field. That's where he has more space to work with as a route runner and as a ball carrier. So if they would just quit with the fade routes, that would make this so much less pronounced of an issue, but it is a reality at this point that he's kind of limited at the catch point, and I do understand to a certain extent why they ran so many of these types of routes. If you're trying to run any kind of downfield passing attack with the level of protection that the Jets had last year, you can't really afford to wait for dig routes to develop. If you're trying to get 15 yards downfield, it's a lot faster to just run directly to that point than to take a winding path. So you'll see a lot of offenses like the Jets last year that have just an unworkable offensive line. Their passing attack kind of reverts to screens, quick game, and fade routes because that's really all they have time to let develop. With better protection, hopefully they can give him a more well-suited route tree, but it could be that Nathaniel Hackett saw that insane catch week 1 and said, this is all I want Garrett Wilson to do. As their wide receiver 2, they signed Mike Williams from the Chargers. His skill set and relative strengths and weaknesses complement what Garrett Wilson brings to the table perfectly. He's a big X receiver that you can isolate, have him work against press coverage, scrimmage. He has elite ball skills, over a 50% contested catch rate in each of his 7 seasons. The other one was 48%, and he had a bit of a drop rate early in his career, but just 1 drop on 115 targets over the last 2 years. He's a technically sound route runner, but not really an elite separator. I think a lot of people think that Mike Williams is just some lumbering jump ball target that can't get open at all. That's not true. He's a functional route runner. There aren't many wasted steps. He's got decent salesmanship at the top of the route, but at his size, 6'4", 6'5", there's just a limit to how explosive he can be out of his breaks compared to someone like Garrett Wilson, for example. He's someone you want running a vertical route tree with some stops and slants mixed in there. As a number 2 to Garrett Wilson, he's a perfect fit, so I love that addition on paper, but the problem projecting to next year is that he tore his ACL in week 3 of the 2023 season. I don't adjust these ratings at all based on likelihood to get injured, like if I think someone's injury prone, but I will make a slight downgrade for a player that's coming off of an injury. I'm not just trying to evaluate them as players, I'm trying to project what they're going to give you this next season. And historically, we've seen that players coming off an ACL, they're usually at like 80% of full strength. I would have Mike Williams at an 81 if he was guaranteed to be fully healthy, but projecting some recovery time, I've got him at a 79. They drafted Malachi Corley in the 3rd round. Definitely a player that I was lower on relative to consensus. Part of that's based on what I see as limitations in his skill set. Part of it's based on historically how these types of receivers have panned out in the NFL. You can see on my scouting report the NFL comparisons. It's Laviska Shenault, Deebo Samuel, and Amari Rodgers. I don't do comparisons based on how good I think they are. That's what the grade's for. Comparisons are just play styles. So if you're skimming through the draft guide, you can get a vibe for what the player's like. And the reason that you see these types of receivers always get compared to Deebo Samuel is because he's the only player of that archetype that's had notable success in the NFL. So if you want to make a comp and not be disrespectful, Deebo's pretty much your only option. I remember watching Laviska Shenault thinking he was going to be unstoppable in the NFL. I remember watching Rondale Moore thinking he was going to be really good. I didn't watch Amari Rodgers tape, but I probably would have bought into that one too. It's really hard for these types of receivers to translate in the NFL because they'll probably still be good after the catch, but will it be good enough like it was in college to make it worth feeding them the football? And with pretty much every data point that we have, the answer to that is no. That doesn't mean Malachi Corley can't be good. It just means that he has to develop his skill set so that he's more than just a yak guy. I think he has the natural talent and athleticism to be a pretty good route runner. He's just really got to refine his technique and footwork. When he gets to the top of a dig or an out route, he's initiating contact, getting hung up by the corner. His footwork is not very clean or efficient, and he just takes too long to get in and out of breaks. And then he also struggled with contested catches. I thought his ball tracking was pretty underwhelming. If he can develop into a capable route runner, I think he has a really high ceiling, but in my opinion, he's quite a ways away from reaching that based on his college tape and watching him at the Senior Bowl. As far as like grading the pick though, I don't have any problem with it. It wasn't a major reach based on my board. I would project Xavier Gibson as their 4th receiver. He was a UDFA in 2023. He only had 229 receiving yards, but I was actually kind of impressed with his tape. To a much lesser extent, he's kind of like Garrett Wilson in the sense that he had a lot of production that was left on the field. He's a slot only that also returns kicks and punts. He had the walk-off touchdown return against Buffalo in week 1. They also gave him a lot of jet sweeps and end arounds. I assume Malachi Corley will take most of those now, but I was pleasantly surprised with what he can do as a route runner. I was really impressed with his ability to burst off the line of scrimmage and accelerate through his release, create that immediate separation. He's quick in and out of breaks, but at his size, he does kind of struggle with physical man coverage. He loses a lot of burst out of his cuts when he's facing tight man. He really needs some space to operate. He's not overly physical at the catch point, but he's got good focus and ball tracking. I don't think he's anything special, but I do view him as someone that can be on the field and produce at least a moderate level. Allen Lazard just put up one of the worst receiver seasons that we've ever seen. He's never been a great athlete or separator, but he was at least somewhat reliable, could win some contested catches. But last year, he led the NFL with an 18% drop rate, was not effective winning through contact, and he didn't have some magical transformation as a route runner. So the result was a completely ineffective receiver that was a healthy scratch at certain points last year. I'm giving him some benefit of the doubt with a 68 rating that he'll at least bounce back and be mediocre, but who knows what's going to happen with him. Jason Brownlee was another UDFA from last year's class. He played in a few games games, did not look like a NFL caliber receiver to me. And then for the 7th receiver, I actually went with Irvin Charles, who I had never heard of until I got into the tape from this past season. He's a UDFA from 2022, has 0 career receptions, but does everything else at a high level. He seems like a dominant run blocker. I first noticed him making a pancake 20 yards down the field. He wasn't on my radar, so I wasn't saving clips for him at that point, but he just kept showing up in the run game whenever he was on the field, so I eventually had to start looking out for him. And then he's also great on special teams. He's the gunner on punt coverage. The safety that they got in the Falcons game, that was set up by Irvin Charles downing it at the 1. I don't know if he's going to make the roster. This is my first time hearing of him, but I really like him as a utility receiver that can do a little bit of everything except play receiver. And probably the biggest pleasant surprise of anyone on the Jets roster was tight end Tyler Conklin. He's a very well-rounded tight end, kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. He isn't very big and he's not a great athlete, so doesn't really fit the mold of a productive tight end, but he's just an outstanding football player. He pretty much runs the same 2 routes over and over again and nobody can stop him. The first one is this option route over the middle of the field. It's kind of like a choice route, but it's really just an in-breaker with the illusion of choice. I hardly ever see him actually break this outside, and he's just so crafty to create separation on an in-breaker against inside leverage. So you see this play against the Broncos, he's being covered by this linebacker who's playing with extremely heavy inside leverage. He's shaded inside almost a full yard, so he's trying to take away slants, digs, any kind of in-breaking route. So for Conklin to separate on an in-breaker, he has to pose a realistic threat that he's breaking his route to the outside. He gets to the top of the route, throttles down, starts swinging his arms. He plants his right foot, gives a head fake to the outside. When Alex Singleton jumps the route, he crosses over, easy separation over the middle. Another one here against the Eagles. Again, he's got extremely heavy inside leverage. He shakes him at the top of the route, gives a head fake, swings his arms. He gets Cunningham to widen out, and then he breaks inside wide open. Sometimes the defender is just leveraged too far inside to create any kind of clean separation, or he just doesn't fall for the bait. That's where you really see Tyler Conklin's contested catch skills come into play. This play, the defensive end forces him to widen out his release, and Jawan Bentley's playing 5 yards leveraged inside. He still does the shake at the top of the route, breaks inside, but he's tightly covered, and Conklin has the strong hands, excellent focus to bring it in through contact. This play, Nakobe Dean barely falls for the route fake, but it's the same story. He's able to track it in tight quarters and make a really difficult catch. So it's in-breaking choice routes like that, or it seems, and he's equally effective at both. He doesn't really have the speed of a traditional seam runner, so the linebacker's usually able to stick with him, but again, he's just so strong and poised at the catch point, it's basically like an open target. I had never really watched Tyler Conklin that closely until a couple days ago, so I'm not sure if it's a consistent thing year after year that I've been missing out on, or if it's just a one-year wonder, but he's about as good of a 6'3" possession tight end that you're gonna find, and he's a phenomenal run blocker, especially for a tight end that isn't a blocking specialist. This play against Buffalo, you see him relocate Taylor Rapp off the line of scrimmage. Right here, he climbs to the second level, gets a knockdown against this Texans defender. You definitely want a bigger player on the line of scrimmage to block defensive ends, but he's absolutely a capable run blocker, one of the bright spots of the Jets run blocking last year. And Jeremy Ruckert seems like a capable second tight end. They took him in the 3rd round in 2022, and I probably don't see him living up to that draft capital, but he's an average to decent athlete, good size, rarely used in the passing game, so it's hard to really tell, but he definitely showed some flashes last year, and he was the Jets' best run blocking tight end in my opinion. You see this play against the Falcons running the same route that we talked about with Tyler Conklin. Inside leverage, fake outside, break inside wide open. He isn't the most explosive player, but I could see him being a solid separator as he continues to develop his technique. He also had a great catch on this slot fade against Kansas City, really good job tracking it over his shoulder, and then as a run blocker, they'd put him on the line of scrimmage, attached to the Y, they'd put him in the backfield. He was really effective as an insert blocker or a lead blocker on reverses and end arounds. He was the one clearing open running lanes on most of Xavier Gibson's carries. He's so powerful with his initial contact and initial punch, he can knock the defender off balance and set him up to finish the block. Kenny Yeboah played in a couple games, didn't flash at all as a receiver, and he was a solid run blocker, but nothing nothing special. And then Zach Kuntz, the RAS All-Star, didn't see the field as a rookie, so that's what the 65 rating's for. The Jets offensive line might be the single most improved unit heading into next season. They're going to have 3 new starters and really 4 because Elijah Vera-Tucker missed most of last year, and their one returning starter, center Joe Tippmann, is kind of like a new player because he was playing out of position last year and he's a second-year player, so you can project some significant development. But this unit is really led by the tackles. It's one of the best tackle duos in the NFL. They're one of 5 teams where I have both tackles rated 80 or above, and Tyron Smith, heading into year 14, is still one of the league's premier left tackles. He was as good last year as I can ever remember him. I've only been watching tape like this for 4 to 5 years, so I didn't watch him early in his career, but he's just a shutdown pass protector and makes it look as good as any tackle that you'll watch. He has maxed out physical traits. His hands are built like satellites, but then he's got near perfect technique snap after snap. If we're looking just at pass protection, my top 3 tackles would be Lane Johnson, Laramie Tunzel, and Tyron Smith. He's a solid run blocker. I can tell by looking at PFF grades early in his career, he was grading out like above 85 almost every year. Nowadays, he's more slightly above average, but keeping Aaron Rodgers upright is priority 1, 2, and 3. And Morgan Moses is a very solid right tackle, extremely powerful. Both of the Jets' offensive line additions from Baltimore fit this same kind of archetype. Powerful gap scheme run blockers with a good anchor and pass pro, but not the most fluid moving laterally. Moses is an extremely effective puller. He had some dominant clothesline blocks out in space. He can create movement at the point of attack. He got a rare pancake on Nick Bosa, and he's got enough pocket range to protect the outside. He sometimes will struggle when pass rushers cross his face. He can't really get depth and then redirect back inside as consistently. But you look at his statistical profile from last year, he's in the green in most metrics. He isn't a top tier pass protector, but for his entire career, he's been consistently above average in that 2nd to 3rd tier. Moving inside, we'll stick with the Baltimore players and go over John Simpson. I would expect Simpson to probably be the weak link on this offensive line if there is one. Like Moses, he's extremely powerful, he's explosive, he's got a strong anchor, really good puller, he delivers a lot of knockout punches in the run game. His tape is pretty fun to watch. But with Moses, he's not the most fluid athlete, but he makes it work, and the result is solid tackle play. With Simpson, he has very poor balance, and that really shows up as a liability at times. He isn't very fluid or flexible, so that makes his job more difficult, but his footwork and technique don't do him any favors. He struggles to mirror in pass pro, doesn't do a good job moving his feet, so he resorts to lunging and leaning. He's still an upgrade in pass pro to any of the guards that they had playing last year outside of Elijah Vera-Tucker and Joe Tippmann when he was in there, but he's right on the cusp, in my opinion, of below average starter to high level backup. And then Elijah Vera-Tucker at right guard, I think, was probably the most disappointing player from my watch through of the Jets season. I came away from his tape very underwhelmed based on my expectations. He's definitely been put in a difficult spot playing every position across the offensive line except center. The fact that he can do that at least a replacement level is fairly valuable, and I think some of his losses in pass pro can be explained away by the fact that he's just not a natural fit to play tackle. Like the sack that he gave up to Nick Bonito where he got beat around the corner, I can watch that and say, okay, if he's playing at guard, that's not going to be an issue. But to me, the quality of pass protection was essentially the same whether he was playing tackle or guard. I didn't really see the foot speed or hand timing of a high quality pass protector. They picked up his 5th-year option, which I probably would have done, especially given what the Jets have dealt with on the offensive line. And I'm pretty sure most Jets fans are going to disagree with me. I actually looked up a Reddit thread of when it was announced that they picked up his option, and everybody seems to like him and think he's a great player. Hopefully it improves playing a full season at one position, but just reporting what I saw, I really felt like he was a weak spot when he was out there. But as a run blocker, it's a completely different story. I have pretty much no notes for Elijah Vera-Tucker in that phase. He has really good drive power on gap scheme runs to uproot a defensive tackle, move him out of a gap. He can get out in space and connect to linebackers at the second level. He's got the explosiveness to reach his landmarks, but then very controlled mirroring a moving target. And then the zone blocking is excellent. He's got some teach tape backside cutoff cutoffs from last year. This one from the Patriots game is just perfect to be able to reach the play side shoulder and then flip your hips, seal them off to the backside. But the last thing I got to mention with Elijah Vera Tucker is that he's struggled to finish the season healthy the last 2 years. He hasn't been able to make it to week 8 for that matter. And both of his injuries actually happened at Mile High Stadium. So good news is the Jets don't play the Broncos this year, but a weird coincidence to have season-ending injuries against the same opponent in back-to-back years. And the final starter is Joe Tippmann, who they took in the second round last year. He played the first few weeks at right guard and then moved back to his natural position at center. And I have similar thoughts about him as I do with Elijah Vera Tucker. I thought he was one of the few plus run blockers on the Jets offensive line last year. Excellent reach blocker. To run outside zone successfully, you've got to have a center that can pull off those difficult reach blocks on a 2-eye. He has pretty good control and target location at the second level. Most of it was climbs on outside zone. If you go back to his college tape, they pulled him a ton, a lot more than you'll ever see for a center in the NFL besides Jason Kelce. But with his power and straight line explosiveness, I think that could be a way that you can feature Joe Tippmann in the run game. And speaking of power, Joe Tippmann's play strength for a rookie offensive lineman was incredible in both phases. In the run game, he's got some serious drive power. He can bury a nose tackle one-on-one. He's got the consistent hand placement into initial contact so he can really centralize his force, and then the leg drive once he latches on to create displacement. Just in terms of being able to move defensive linemen backwards, I think the Jets offensive line stacks up with anyone in the NFL. And then in pass pro, he has a rock solid anchor. Watching and talking about so many rookie offensive linemen, it gets repetitive because the scouting report for pretty much everyone is that they need to get stronger, add play strength, improve their anchor. I don't think I ever saw Joe Tippmann lose just straight up to a bull rush. There were some plays where the pass rusher went speed to power, kind of knocked him off balance, and then they were able to win the edge or something. But as far as just moving him backwards, that did not happen at all from what I saw. And a lot of times he was actually able to get underneath their pads and redirect the bull rush backwards. But the rest of his pass pro tape was very shaky, and honestly, the 75 rating that I'm giving him, that's being pretty generous projecting development. He was not a 75 last year based on my scale. He doesn't really move his feet well at this point. He's a habitual leaner into contact, lunges into his punch consistently. There's certain aspects of his game, especially as a run blocker, where it seems like he's got some good lateral fluidity, but that doesn't show up in pass protection. When a rusher starts to get the edge on either side, Tippmann's instinct is to lean and basically leave his feet and just lunge into contact. He ends up on the ground way too often, especially if you hit him with a bull rush initially. He'll just lock into his anchor and not really expect you to get into a counter move. So he'll plant his feet in the ground, set his anchor. When the defender crosses his face, he's not ready to mirror them laterally, so he has to give a last ditch effort, leave his feet. A lot of times he ends up grabbing the jersey, hanging on by a thread, and has some borderline holding plays. I think the main Achilles heel of this offensive line is going to be the mirror ability from center to left guard. If you hit Joe Tippmann and John Simpson with a bunch of TE stunts, I just see them having a difficult time passing those off and staying in front of them. Hopefully it's a technical issue with Joe Tippmann and he can get that fixed heading into year 2, but definitely need to see some improvement there. And then if I was a Jets fan, I would be waking up every day thankful that they took Olu Fashanu in the first round. The Brock Bowers pick that was rumored at certain times throughout the draft process, seriously, that would have made me lose respect for Joe Douglas as a GM. The responsible pick, not only for next year, but for the long term, was to take a tackle regardless of what you did in free agency. And they were able to get Olu Fashanu out of Penn State at pick 11, elite upside as a pass protector. His lateral mobility and foot speed, I think, was best in this class. He's not a player like so many tackles coming out that has no idea what to do with his hands. I do think he needs to polish up his hand technique some. Occasionally, he has a tendency to come in wide with his punch, give rushers access to his frame, and run blocking was definitely not a strength for him, but it steadily improved over the course of his college career. By the end of last season, he was actually, I would say, an above average zone blocker. Probably going to end up developing into more of a pass blocking specialist, but I think he can at least be decent in the run game. He doesn't have to play as a rookie, but he kind of gets the best of both worlds because Tyron Smith isn't going to practice, so he's going to get all those reps, but then he's not being thrown into the fire and, lose his confidence or anything. So Fashanu's really good depth. I project him as the third best third tackle in the NFL. The rest of the backups aren't great, but no one really has offensive line depth, but most of these guys started at some point last year. My favorite backup besides Fashanu is probably Wes Schweitzer. Not exactly sure how to pronounce his name, but I thought he was probably the most steady presence of all of their backup interior players. He's a decent drive blocker. He's got pretty good hand usage. He's a lot bigger than Max Mitchell, Jake Hansen, Xavier Newman, so he naturally has a much better anchor than them, but there still were some times that he got launched and had some pretty embarrassing reps. Not a starting caliber player, but not the worst thing in the world if he has to start 1 or 2 games. They took Carter Warren in the 4th round last year. He played some as a rookie, especially down the stretch. I don't think he was ready to play. Kind of similar to Joe Tippmann, he just has a bad habit of engaging with the block, locking his arms, stopping his feet, and then if you give any kind of secondary rush effort, you're pretty much guaranteed to get late pressure because he really struggles to gear back up and protect the corner. He has poor pad level as a run blocker, struggles to get underneath defenders and drive them back, but I thought his anchor was actually naturally pretty solid. He doesn't have great anchor technique, but he has really good play strength, so you don't see him lose to power that often. I still think he has some upside, but based on what he put on tape last year, not someone that you want seeing any kind of extended playing time. Max Mitchell might have been the worst offensive lineman that played for the Jets last year. If you take like all of the weaknesses that I've listed for the other offensive linemen and combine them, that's Max Mitchell as a player. He had some fun college tape against a really low level of competition, but none of that dominance has translated to the NFL. He's so out of control from a technical standpoint and doesn't have the physical traits to fall back on. Probably only talked about him for long enough to play a few clips, but just know that the clips that you've just seen, I've got like 50 more of those loaded up. Jake Hansen played about 3.5 games for them at right guard. He was okay at times. He's a technically sound player overall. He's just lacking the recovery skills and athleticism to be a starting caliber pass blocker. And finally, we've got Xavier Newman, who's also a pretty technically sound player. He's a much better athlete than Jake Hansen, but probably has the worst anchor of any of the backups. He was a part of the disaster game against the Giants where Dexter Lawrence just wrecked everyone. The rest of his tape was definitely better, but he'll still lose to a bull rush 2 or 3 times every game. Also really seems to struggle with his protection assignments and picking up stunts and twists. So 9th best offense, but honestly a much better offensive roster. The offensive coordinator rating is dragging down the overall score a little bit. But regardless of how Aaron Rodgers plays, who stays healthy, I think the defense is still going to be the strength of this team. I've got them with the 2nd best defense in the NFL. Every unit outside of safety ranks in the top 13, and you could argue safety's the least important position. The edge rushers rank 13th, and the interior defensive line ranks 12th, so pretty solid, but I've got to say I disagree with how they handled those position groups in the offseason. I think choosing not to re-sign Bryce Huff and then trading a 3rd round pick for Hassan Reddick, who I view as a downgrade, just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and then replacing John Franklin Myers and Quentin Jefferson with Javon Kinlaw and Lecky Fotu, I think are downgrades in both instances. But Jermaine Johnson is another player that just lapped my expectations for him heading into his tape. A couple games in, I was fixated on Jermaine Johnson as a budding star, already a high quality starter, but someone that could break out and be top 10 at his position. His speed to power is lethal, one of the best power rushing edge defenders in the NFL already. It's by far his most frequently used move, but he has an incredibly high success rate with it. He's a tall and long player, so he can establish separation from the blocker's frame, which is what you need to be an effective power rusher. But what a lot of players of his physical profile don't have is the flexibility and the ability to get low and create leverage, maximize your displacement into the pocket. His matchup with Jake Matthews, the Falcons left tackle, was a massacre. Matthews is a very reliable, quality starter, but Jermaine Johnson was walking him back into the pocket snap after snap after snap. This play right here, you see the effect of having 2 elite power rushers adjacent to each other, the way that it just compresses the pocket, prevents the quarterback from having any space to step into. But it wasn't just one matchup, it was pretty much every week he was getting at least a couple wins with his speed to power. The Jets really prioritize pocket pushers with their pass rushers, and that has its pros and cons. It's a much more consistent and reliable strategy to pressure the quarterback. You're less reliant on mistakes from the offensive line. If you've got a good bull rush, it's kind of something that you can just go to over and over again and expect it to work. But with speed to power, you're getting a lot lot fewer clean wins, so you're more likely to see those players have a lot of pressures and relatively few sacks. That sort of dynamic plays out to, I think, a greater extent with Quinnen Williams, which we'll talk about in more depth later. But for Jermaine Johnson, the next step is going to be continuing to diversify his pass rushing plan, honing in on ways to defeat the hands and get more quick wins. I didn't chart it, but if I had to estimate, I would say 90% of pass rushing snaps, Jermaine Johnson's using speed to power. He would go entire games without ever using a different move, and there wasn't too much of a reason to go away from it because it was so effective. But going forward, you want to be able to win consistently with as many different methods as possible. But for the most part, I think it's a volume issue as opposed to a skill issue. When he did try other moves, he had an extremely high success rate. He doesn't have elite bend, which could slightly limit him as a high side rusher, but outside of that, he has every trait and most of the skills that you look for. He's got long arms, he's explosive, he's twitchy, he's quick with his hands. There's always room to improve with your hand usage, but he's at a really good starting point. He was really effective on third down, lining up over guards and beating them with crossface moves. Out on the edge, he might not have as extreme of an athletic advantage, but against a guard, they just can't really mirror him in open space. This play, he comes in late to a 3-tech alignment. Quinn Miners gives him a 2-hand punch. Johnson quickly reacts, gets into a double swipe, wins the edge, gets into the pocket. You do see on this play some stiffness at the top of the rush trying to finish. This play against the Chargers, he squares up, evens out his leverage, quick swipe to the outside hand, gets into the pocket, again can't finish the sack. And then this play against the Giants, he is being blocked by a tight end, but he beats the outside hand. This play, he is able to turn the corner and finish the sack. You can see he at least has functional bend. No one's going to mistake him for Hassan Reddick, but it's adequate at least. But what really gets you excited is seeing him work these moves against offensive tackles. Like I said, he doesn't have Hassan Reddick, Bryce Huff type of burst and explosiveness. He's not going to have a ton of success just using a speed rip, attacking the outside shoulder, but he does a really good job of threatening the inside rush to create a short corner for himself and kind of mask that limitation. This rep against Laramie Tunsil, you can see his initial path is attacking the B gap, the inside half, so Tunsil can't get early depth in his pass set, and then he's really fluid transitioning into the cross chop, beating the outside hand, and once he wins that edge, Laramie Tunsil hasn't gotten any depth, so it's an extremely short path to CJ Stroud. Same thing here against Teron Armstead. Initially, he's rushing down the middle, kind of threatening towards the inside. Armstead can't really widen out to protect against the speed rush because he has to respect Jermaine Johnson's speed to power, but then Johnson can transition to the cross chop, beat the outside hand, attack all that space that Armstead left open for him. And the key point with these plays is that week after week, Jermaine Johnson's putting out so many reps of good speed to power tape. Going into that matchup, the tackles have to respect that move, so they can't sell out at all to protect the outside. And it's a small sample size of him actually trying to rush the outside, but I mean, he's getting high quality wins against Laramie Tunsil, Teron Armstead, Rashawn Slater. I think if he just tried speed rushing more often, he would have a lot of success. And to complete his moveset, he's also able to use inside counters. Right here, he beats the Patriots rookie tackle with an inside spin. He can also transition into an inside secondary rush effort when his first move fails. You see this play against Philly. He's trying the speed rush, double swipes the outside hand, but the tackle does a good job staying in front of it, but he's leaning too far upfield. Jermaine Johnson sees the opportunity to pry open the inside shoulder. He slices into the B gap, hits Jalen Hurts, and ends up forcing an interception. The thing with Jermaine Johnson, though, that gets me so excited is that he's more than just a promising pass rusher. To me, he's like the Kyle Hamilton of edge rushers. He's 260, 265. Really, he plays the run like he's 280. He has an elite anchor. He's able to set the edge so consistently. Overall, I view him as one of the better run defending edge rushers in the NFL. These edge setting reps are just disrespectful. This play against the Dolphins, he establishes early control on the right tackle, yanks him like he's starting a lawnmower, makes the stop in the backfield. Right here, you can see how much knockback that initial punch creates, completely stops the tackle's momentum. Johnson sets the edge, holds his ground. Once the running back gets past him, though, he's able to disengage from the block and then match the running back's speed and make the tackle out in the alley. Tight end blocks straight up do not work against him. Durham Smythe on this rep had no chance from the start. Another one here against the Chargers, flattens the tight end, explodes into the gap and makes the stop. And then this play, he completely stands up this puller. I mean, from the point that they make contact, Jermaine Johnson doesn't move backwards 1 inch. And then he's basically just two-gapping like a nose tackle, sheds the block once the running back enters his gap. He can chase down screens, he can make plays in coverage, he'll drop into the hook and play man coverage on a tight end. Speaking of Kyle Hamilton, they actually both had a pick six against the Browns on kind of similar looking plays, and he even had special teams value. He had a blocked punt against the Commanders. He's developing into one of these stat sheet stuffers that just impacts every single possible phase of the game. Still on his way to becoming a true number one as a pass rusher, but definitely ahead of the curve, and I'm confident he can get to that point. Hassan Reddick, like I said, I think is a downgrade from Bryce Huff, and a pretty significant one. If you're getting the Reddick from a couple years ago, maybe it's more of a lateral move, but based on what we saw last season, I thought there was a very noticeable slowing down of his pass rushing ability. He's still going to be one of the best athletes on the line of scrimmage. He's got a really good cross chop, good inside counter, spin move. I think he's a really solid pass rusher in a vacuum. It's just like, man, comparing him to Bryce Huff, this defense could have been even more dominant. I'll be kind of brief on Will McDonald because I did a full film breakdown on this channel if you want to check that out. He didn't play much as a rookie. There just weren't a lot of opportunities for snaps. When he was on the field, he was pretty efficient. He had the second highest pass rush win rate of any of the rookie edge rushers. His speed rush and explosive first step and bend around the corner immediately translated. You can see he's got really high potential as a high side rusher. The inside spin was his primary counter at Iowa State. Only used it a few times in the NFL, but it's such a small sample size. I expect we'll see that more often next year. He's just got to add weight so he can get better against the run and hopefully add some sort of power element as a pass rusher. Never have really seen him be able to win with speed to power at any level of competition. Maybe he did it in high school, I don't know. But for a player with his get off and his length, like that's the perfect profile to be a speed to power rusher. So I think he's a complimentary third DPR right now. And then if he does add play strength, the sky's the limit for him. Michael Clemens is just a steady early down run defender. The pass rushing impact is negligible, but he can set the edge, hold the point. They signed Tack McKinley, who hasn't played in a while, but I feel like he's better than a fifth edge rusher. And then Braden McGregor is a UDFA. I was kind of lukewarm on him as a prospect. So the edge rotation is extremely deep. The defensive line comes in with a similar ranking, but it's spread out a lot differently. Quinnen Williams, I view as the third best defensive tackle in the NFL. I've got Chris Jones and Dexter Lawrence at 1 and 2, and then Quinnen Williams I think is a clear 3. And Williams is the anchor of this front seven. He has the best bull rush in the NFL across any position. He defends the run at an elite level. I think he had the best season in run defense so far for his career. The one thing that might give some people pause is that he doesn't have a ton of sack production. He went through the first 9 weeks of last season without a sack, ended up finishing with 6 according to PFF, and part of that's just statistical noise to a certain extent. All you can do as a pass rusher is just try to win. Whether or not you actually convert that into a sack a lot of times has to do with whether or not the quarterback gets rid of the ball, if there's someone open for him to throw it to. If you watch pretty much any game of Quinnen Williams, you're going to see a consistently effective pass rusher that last year just got sacks at a slightly lower rate. There were some missed sack opportunities that are on Quinnen Williams. He only missed 2 tackles through the first 13 weeks, and then the last 5 he had 7 missed tackles. And like we said with Jermaine Johnson, players that win more with power are going to convert pressures to sacks usually at a slightly lower rate, as opposed to a player like Chris Jones, who's getting a lot of quick wins with his hands where he's crossing the blocker's face, winning an early edge. Quinnen Williams is just relentlessly pushing the pocket. Most plays he ends up with his blocker in the quarterback's lap, and he's basically just funneling him towards the defensive ends. He's essentially like a hydraulic press that's just going to slowly but inevitably work his way into the pocket. And what's most impressive about his game is that there's no drop off in his effectiveness based on competition. Whether it's a bottom tier guard or Joe Tooney, Landon Dickerson, Trey Smith, his power translates against anyone. And then like I said, he took a major step forward, I thought, as a run defender in 2023. You're really starting to see the combination of elite play strength and physical traits with close to perfect technique. He's got an immovable anchor. He's great with his hands to deconstruct blocks. He can flow with stretch runs, chase down outside zone to the sideline. He truly is an elite athlete for his size, and anytime he's a little bit out leveraged to make a tackle in the backfield, it seems like he's always able to fully extend and make up that distance by a hair. The rest of these players are backup caliber defensive linemen. They signed Javon Kinlaw, who is the first round pick for San Francisco a few years ago that that didn't really pan out. He was still a rotational player last year, but he more than doubled his pressures from his first 3 seasons. As a pass rusher, he has a lightning quick first step to get into the blocker's frame. He's got the length to establish separation and decent drive power. You can still see the high-end traits and what made him a first-round pick. The bull rush isn't really effective at a high enough rate to make him, a great pass rusher, but he at least contributes. But he is not a good run defender. He's got a high-cut build, and he plays with really high pad level. He gets moved back consistently and is a decisive net negative in that phase. They got Solomon Thomas coming back. He's similar to Javon Kinlaw in some ways. He'll make some splash plays as a pass rusher. He wins more with quickness as opposed to Javon Kinlaw's power, but in the run game, he's a borderline liability. Based on watching a lot of offensive linemen, I came into this film session with a much lower rating for Solomon Thomas. I was so used to seeing him get pancaked by like every offensive lineman that I watched. He does offset that to a certain extent by generating some positive plays, but still a weakness on early downs. They also signed Leki Fotu, who based on his size, you would think is a good run defender, but pound for pound, one of the worst run defenders in the NFL over the last 4 to 5 years. I think he does a good job with his hands engaging with blocks, and he does have pretty good natural play strength, but his footwork gets him into so much trouble, and he ends up on the ground way more often than a 330-pounder ever should. And then he gives you absolutely nothing as a pass rusher. He's never eclipsed 7 pressures in a single season. Leonard Taylor is a notable UDFA, someone with some really enticing physical traits, never really put it all together and maximized his potential at Miami. And then Jalen Holmes is a journeyman veteran, noticed him in a couple games getting pancaked, so I gave him a 65. But now we start to get into the real true strength of this defense and really this team. The linebackers rank 2nd in the NFL to the 49ers. A lot of teams don't even have one good linebacker, but the Jets have 2. They're one of only 4 teams with 2 linebackers that I have rated above an 80. And I don't know if it's a hot take, but I actually kind of view Quincy Williams as the better of the 2. It's really close, but the explosive impact plays that he's able to create, I think just put him a slight step ahead. He led NFL defenders last year with 80 stops. PFF defines a stop as a tackle that results in an unsuccessful play for the offense. The next highest was Bobby Wagner at 71. And with Quincy Williams, it seems like every tackle that he makes is the most dominant, violent tackle that I've ever seen in my life. His closing burst is next level, and he just erases ball carriers into the ground. So as a run defender, he makes a ton of plays, but he is pretty undersized. He's not really a stack and shed linebacker. If he can't avoid or evade it, he will get stuck to blocks, occasionally get put on his back. And over the second half of the season, I started to notice a lot more missed tackles. The stats kind of bear that out with his missed tackle rate. And then in coverage, his lack of size actually plays to his advantage. I think he's the best man cover linebacker in the league, whether it's sticking with a seam or a wheel route running vertically or mirroring like a Texas route from the backfield. You don't see many linebackers that can stick with running backs, tight ends, even occasionally a receiver the way that Quincy Williams can. He isn't the most assignment secure in zone coverage. There will be some occasional coverage busts, but overall he's clearly a net positive in that phase. 2023 was his best season by far, so we'll see if he can maintain that level of play, but based on what he showed last year, he's an easy top 10 linebacker. And not far behind him is CJ Mosley, who I view as kind of a B+ player in every aspect. He has the range and athleticism, top tier physicality, really good block shedding ability, hit power. He's more of a playmaker in coverage than a consistent lockdown cover linebacker, but again, still a strength of his game, especially when stuff's developing in front of him. He's extremely instinctive playing routes in the quick game. He just had a couple back-breaking dropped interceptions, and the main thing holding him back from the elite tier is just consistency. And I wouldn't even call him inconsistent. He just has the occasional misfit or missed tackle or blown coverage assignment. Still a top 10 linebacker, but I think players like Fred Warner or Roquan Smith are slightly more reliable. And then also got to shout out Jamien Sherwood, another player that I was not familiar with, probably because he hadn't really played at all. He was a 5th round pick back in 2021. 31, never really been able to see the field, and he only got 193 snaps last year, but whenever they played him, he played well. And I think if one of their top 2 linebackers went down, I would feel perfectly comfortable putting Jamien Sherwood into the lineup. He was a safety back at Auburn, and he's still listed at 216 pounds. He definitely doesn't weigh that now. One of the clear strengths of his game is actually his ability to take on and play blocks. He seems to be a pretty reliable, technically sound tackler with a lot of stopping power, and I saw him give up one play in coverage, 42-yard deep over against the Raiders, Devontae Adams. But outside of that, he looked pretty good getting into his hook zone drops, made a few plays in the screen game. Hard to really evaluate with such a small sample size, but I really liked what I saw. And the Jets cornerback room is the best in the NFL. There's no one that really comes close to matching what this top 3 gives you in coverage. And going back to another separation plot from PFF, you can see how dominant this trio was. Sauce Gardner and Michael Carter had 2 of the best seasons of all time in terms of preventing separation, and DJ Reed, the quote-unquote weak link, was still about 70th percentile. And they're led by Sauce Gardner, who I think is not only the best cornerback, but has an argument for the best player in the NFL. I'm a huge fan of Pat Surtain's game. I think he's clearly the second best corner, but to me, there's just no argument between him and Sauce when you look at the consistency week after week. And I've got Sauce, Myles Garrett, and Tyreek Hill with a 97 rating, tied for the 3 best players league-wide. I did a full video on Sauce Gardner explaining why I think he's the best corner in the NFL, so I'll keep this somewhat brief. To me, he does everything at an elite level except generate turnovers. If he was able to convert a few more of his interception opportunities, that's what would push him up to a 99 rating. He's never going to be a high interception guy. He's just too good in man coverage, so he doesn't get targeted enough to have the volume of opportunities as some other corners. The classic Sauce Gardner stat line is 2 targets, 1 reception for 3 yards, but that makes converting the opportunities he does get even more important. But outside of that, he just has a complete game as a cover corner. He can mug you at the line of scrimmage, one of the best press corners in the league. But what people don't appreciate about Sauce enough is his mirror ability and footwork. He has this reputation of being a really grabby corner. If you watch a lot of corners across the NFL, he's not much grabbier than, any of the other top ones. I think from his rookie tape, being grabby down the field is a somewhat valid criticism, but at this point in his career, he's actually one of the best corners at trusting his footwork and mirroring without making unnecessary contact. He puts out so much teach tape on playing routes from off coverage, playing soft shoe press where he's not even punching or using his hands. I think it's a combination of people not really understanding the rules and bitterness from divisional rivals, but the idea that Sauce Gardner's getting away with all these egregious penalties is one of the biggest misconceptions across the entire sport. If he can just start getting, 2 or 3 interceptions a year, the Sauce haters will really have nothing left. Can't be dropping those easy ones like the play against Dallas. And yeah, ultimately, if Sauce Gardner doesn't have any fans, I have passed away. DJ Reed is about as good as it gets for a cornerback too. He's definitely less consistent in coverage than Sauce, but more consistent than a lot of teams' number 1. I think his trump card elite trait is his explosiveness gearing up from a standstill. When a receiver releases and declares vertically, or he gives up some early leverage on a drag route, he has instant start-stop ability to recover short distances and eliminate a step or 2 of separation. A good portion of cornerback play comes down to how quickly can you close 2 to 3 yards of space, and DJ Reed does that as well as anyone. A couple examples just to show you what I'm talking about. This play, he's covering a drag route from Tyreek Hill across the middle of the field. He's 5 yards off the line of scrimmage, so Tyreek has about a 5-yard head start, but once he identifies the route, you see the explosiveness and closing burst to eat up that cushion almost immediately, and he undercuts the route for the interception. This play, he's covering Stephon Diggs on a stop route from off coverage. Diggs is threatening vertically, and then he sits down, cuts his route off at the sticks. At the break point, Reed does allow a little bit of separation. He's maybe a tick slow responding to the route break, but again, the recovery burst to close 2 yards of separation in a split second turns this from a 3rd down conversion to an incompletion. I thought he was a little bit less consistent over the second half of the season, still a solid, starting caliber corner, just less discipline in coverage. Through the first 8 weeks, he allowed 161 yards. Over the second 7 weeks, he allowed 314 and 2 touchdowns. In his defense, though, 38% of his yards allowed last season were to Jalen Waddle or Tyreek Hill. And Michael Carter has an argument for being the most underrated player in the NFL. If you poll the average NFL fan, they either don't know who he is or think he's a former UNC running back, but he's the best cover nickel in the game right now. There are some others that give you more when you account for run support. He's not a great run defender. He can shoot into the backfield and make some plays, but he's undersized, so really struggles at times to deal with contact. But if I needed a slot corner to cover a receiver one-on-one for one snap, I'm taking Michael Carter. They added Isaiah Oliver, who's a backup caliber slot only, solid depth, but never really worked out in Atlanta. Brandon Eccles, who I could be mispronouncing, is their main backup on the outside. He had a nice pick six on a terrible pass against the Dolphins, but not really a reliable cover player, and he gets picked on when he's on the field. And then the seventh corner, I don't really think matters, but I went with Jarius Monroe out of Tulane, who I didn't watch, so I'm not sure how good he is. And finally, the weak spot of this defense is safety, which ranks 25th. Not a strength, but not bad enough that it's a liability. I assume Tony Adams is going to be one of the starters. He was a UDFA in 2022, started all but a few games last year, and he looks like a good find. He's a converted corner, so he is a bit undersized as a box safety when it comes to playing blocks. He can get washed out of the play if a blocker makes contact, but he also has the speed and closing burst that you would expect for a former corner, and he's extremely physical, not someone that shies away from contact at all. He's overall a solid contributor in run support. He can crash downhill, makes a lot of plays in the backfield. Another violent tackler, which is not out of the ordinary for this defense, but something he needs to improve is his open field tackling as the last line of defense. He's kind of a one-speed player that just straight lines to the ball carrier and takes some reckless pursuit angles, and when he does break down and come to balance, he'll sometimes have issues regaining speed to stick with a jump cut. In coverage, he had 3 interceptions. They were more on the low quality end of the spectrum, basically just thrown right to him, but there weren't a lot of negative plays in coverage, which is step one for a safety. Most of his bad plays were a result of him getting confused by motion. I think he's a solid starter, kind of the definition of a 75 rating on my scale. He's still young, so he could definitely improve. Like, I probably would have said something similar about Michael Carter at some point in his career, but we'll see what Tony Adams can develop into. They got Chuck Clark, who will probably be the other starter. He signed last offseason, but then tore his ACL in June, so we haven't seen him in a Jets uniform. He's a pure box safety, great run defender, not as confident in his ability in deep zone coverage, but somebody that you want on the field. And Ashton Davis is a bit of a wild card or X factor for this safety group. For most of his career, he was not really an impact as a safety after being a third-round pick in 2020, but last year in a reserve role, he made a handful of plays in coverage. It felt like every other week he was getting an interception or a pass breakup. He actually had 3 interceptions and 4 pass breakups on just 110 coverage snaps. That could easily be a low sample size thing, but maybe he has turned the corner in year 4. He re-signed this offseason on a 1-year deal, so we'll see if he can carve out a starting role and really prove himself. And that's going to do it for the Jets preview. If you enjoy the video, make sure to like and leave a comment to help the channel grow. These team previews take a ton of time to complete, so likes and comments are greatly appreciated. And if you want to view my full power rankings and positional ratings, I've got that as a web application that's linked in the description. It's a sortable table. You can click on the row, see the full team breakdown, all the stats and graphics that are in these videos.